Good evening and welcome to our webinar. I'm Chris Talaco, the Chair of Coalition for Conservation, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community, paying my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. For those of you who are here for the first time, Coalition for Conservation, or C4C, is a registered charity that advocates for an effective climate agenda aligning with conservative values. We engage with conservatives around the globe and in Australia to support each other on our efforts to reduce emissions and to move towards a net zero economy. Tonight, we have an excellent panel of experts who will be discussing the challenges of our environment due to the effects of climate change. We'll also hear about the latest New South Wales State of the Environment report, the role of government and private sector in reversing nature destruction, and how protecting and restoring nature is key of solving climate change. A brief background on the New South Wales State of the Environment for those who haven't seen it. This report is released every 3 years. It's an independent report. It provides data on natural environment, giving us detailed information on 6 environmental themes. They talk about economic activity, human settlement or population, climate and air, land, biodiversity, water, and marine. Now, at international level, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report that was released last year identified biodiversity loss as one of the top 3 global risks by severity, alongside climate action failure and extreme weather events. So to tackle this problem, many countries are coming together this year in China at the UN Biodiversity Conference, or COP15, to sign a new global agreement to reverse nature loss by 2030. So we felt this was an important time to discuss this topic and the findings of these reports, because the condition of our natural environment is a major determinant of our quality of life. Now, in terms of the format tonight for the event, I'll first invite each panelist to outline their key messages, and then I'll ask them a few questions and move to a Q&A from the audience. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. And I'd like to briefly introduce our special guests. It's a privilege to have here the Honourable James Griffin. He's the New South Wales Minister for Environment and Heritage and the member for Manly. James was elected to New South Wales Parliament in 2017, and I know he's a very strong advocate for the environmental and climate change policies. We have Eddie Listorti. He's the founding partner and CEO of Regenerative Capital, which allocates investment capital to carbon finance projects. They also provide structuring and advisories on sustainable development assets, ESG facilitation, carbon credit portfolio, and registry management. We have Dr. Megan Evans. She's a lecturer in the public sector management within the School of Business, UNSW Canberra. And she holds an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellowship, which is examining the growth of private sector investment in biodiversity and natural capital. And finally, we have Nathaniel Pillay. He's the Business and Biodiversity Campaign Lead at Australian Conservation Foundation. Networks to push business to better measure and manage impact on biodiversity. So a very warm welcome to all of our guests. And let's start with the Minister. Minister, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. We could maybe hear from you on some insights on the latest State of the Environment report first. And perhaps if you could share some of the policies or the frameworks that the New South Wales government will be implementing or has already started putting in place to address those findings from the report.
Wonderful, thanks, Chris. And I too would like to begin by acknowledge the traditional custodians of land on which I'm coming to you from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Thank you so much for having me this evening. And from the outset, I'd also like to acknowledge your leadership and your commitment, Chris, to the cause of conservation and environmental protection. You've really built up Coalition for Conservation to be a national voice for a very important issue, which is the environment and sustainability. And equally to my other panelists, thank you so much for giving up your time to be here this evening. As this is my first Coalition for Conservation event, I thought I'd just take a moment to introduce myself. The environment has long been a profound focus of mine, both at a professional and a political and personal level. Personally, I've enjoyed living in Manly, which is surrounded by wonderful beauty of our marine environment, also some wonderful national parks. I professionally served for 2 years as the previous minister's parliamentary secretary, and has also served on the Legislative Assembly Committee for Environment and Planning, and so bring with me a deep institutional and legislative knowledge of environmental decision-making in New South Wales. I've been asked to speak tonight about the State of the Environment report, and I think it's fair to say that at best, the report was a mixed bag for the environment in our state. On the upside, it's heartening to know that the overall rate of greenhouse gas emissions has fallen by 17% since 2005. And as many of you would know, we've set very clear objectives to halve our emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050. In more good news, littering is down. And as many of you would have seen in the news, there are new recycling facilities opening right across the state for problem wastes, and that includes plastic. Nearly 10% of New South Wales is now conserved in the public reserve system, and that means the expansion of our national parks. However, on the downside, as we've just witnessed and experienced, the effects of climate change are severe, and they will become broader and intensify in the future. Equally as concerning is the number of species that are listed as threatened in New South Wales, and that unfortunately continues to rise. And one focus of mine, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is the need to do better at conservation on private land and restoring biodiversity loss right across New South Wales. So I thought I'd focus on the issue of native vegetation and the need for conservation because, frankly, the report could not be any clearer when it came to the challenge that we face, not only in New South Wales, but across Australia. And really, it's a rallying call for all of us. Over the past 200 years, Australia, unfortunately, has experienced the largest decline of biodiversity of any continent. We know that governments can't resolve these challenges alone, and I don't say that to abrogate responsibility. I say it because more than 60% of Australia's land is privately owned or managed, and many of our least protected ecosystems are found there. But what, as a government, we do have an obligation to do is to lead, is to collaborate and be a willing partner. And that's why I'm very proud to say that this year I'm making it a personal ministerial responsibility to massively increase landholder participation in private land conservation across New South Wales. And I'll do a lot of that work via the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. And I'm absolutely determined to continue to find innovative solutions that can drive more investment into private land conservation. And whether this be through some newer initiatives like a conservation accreditation program, improved awareness by consumers at the other end of the cycle of conservation-friendly products, or facilitation of private sector investment in natural capital, which I think is something that many of us are quite excited about if we get the framework and the regulatory settings right. And all of that in the hope of really continuing to build partnerships to acquire land and scale restoration of habitat. In addition to all of that, you can continue to expect to see from me an expansion of the national park estate by strategic acquisitions and transfers that protect and rehabilitate high conservation value areas. So they're two, broadly speaking, big items on the agenda, but that also, in addition, this year will include remediating contaminated land, real action to improve the health of our waterways, and continuing to scale up the circular economy. I thought I'd finish with really saying that in the 12 weeks or so that I've had the privilege to be the minister, one of the most rewarding parts of the portfolio has been seeing the Saving Our Species program in action. And I know that many of you on this webinar are partners in that, and will be familiar with the $175 million that we've committed over 10 years. It's conservation in action, and it's working. And I think that one thing we all need to be conscious of is sometimes the discussion about the environment comes perilously close to being overwhelmingly negative, and then that disempowers people and they start to switch off. But in the last couple of weeks, whether it's releasing bilbies into the Pilliga or just this Friday, a release of the Plains Wanderer birds back into the grasslands at Hay for the first time, there's been some terrific work across the state in conservation. And we've done that with partners on this call and the likes of Taronga. So there are some huge challenges ahead in sustainability and conservation, but I really do believe that we can make a difference. We can turn the tide if we all rise to the challenge. I'm particularly excited about the upcoming COP15. I think that if we work together, we can do a better job of raising awareness about the importance of COP15, and I'd welcome opportunities to work with stakeholders as that gets closer. So if your organisation on this call and you've got a conservation project, get in touch. I want to make it happen. I want to work with you and the panel to keep delivering some great outcomes. Look forward to working with Coalition for Conservation to drive innovative programs that are going to keep delivering for all of us, generation now and also into the future, to ensure that we deliver a wonderful environment. So thank you, Chris, and hopefully that's a reasonable overview of where my agenda will be going for the rest of the year.
Thank you very much, Minister James. It's great to hear that you're tackling land management. I mean, we can talk about this later, but of course, fires and how we manage fires is going to be something very important for New South Wales as well. I think one of the things that I felt were quite positive in the report was that New South Wales is on track achieving the decoupling of carbon emissions from economic growth. I think I read that it shows that between 2010 and 2019, we had 13% drop in carbon emissions, but still 26% growth of the economy. So that's a good result. But we'll have lots of questions for you later. I'll move on to the next panelist now, Eddie from Viridios. Eddie, welcome. And can you firstly perhaps tell us a little bit about Viridios, and you're the founder, and also touch on sustainable development goals and what can be done to increase their intrinsic value when we think about restoring biodiversity, especially.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks for inviting me. Viridios Capital is an Australian incorporated financial services licensee. We have two companies, one which advises clients on all their offsetting and ESG needs. We also invest, finance and originate carbon projects. We recently partnered with Tribeca Investment Partners to launch a co-branded carbon fund. And our second company is our technology business, which uses artificial intelligence to generate a fair value on all the attributes of a carbon project, including any verified co-benefits or SDGs. And the valuation risk engine has been in production for over a year. It's subscribed by many global corporations. We've also recently launched a series of carbon indices with S&P Platts, a world first, which shows the different price points for a whole range of different carbon removal and avoided carbon projects. For example, soil organic carbon credits, cook stoves, and avoided deforestation. And we have over 35 staff globally across the two businesses. So Christina, we set up this business because we saw a gap in the market and really a lack of quality hedging and valuation instruments to address both climate change and sustainable development goals. Now, according to the UN, there is currently an investment shortage of $2.4 trillion per year to achieve the 2030 SDG goals. And we're not going to fill that gap without clear alignment across all sectors. So in my view, it's the private sector that will have the most meaningful role to play in deploying capital to least developing countries. And although it's not mandatory to do that, the risk of not doing it will be reflected in a lower ESG rating. And we all know the results of that: lower share price, weaker sales, and so on. At Viridios, with our AI carbon and SDG valuation tool, we find companies want to pay more for impact that is quantified and verified along with the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals. According to Ecosystem Carbon Survey data, 62% of carbon credits purchased last year had co-benefits certified. And historically, it was difficult to quantify how much a given offset project contributed to the SDGs, which led to a significant amount of SDG washing in the carbon market. Now, Gold Standard, an NGO in Switzerland, for example, now requires all carbon offset projects on their registry to quantify and verify the SDG impacts of their carbon projects. They also introduced SDG impact tools to ease the process of measuring and reporting those Sustainable Development Goal impacts. And now with Viridios generating a fair value for each SDG project, today different actors in the financial system have access to better data and financial tools to make more informed decisions around ESGs. Now, in regards to deforestation, around 20% of global emissions are caused by agricultural land use and forestry. Deforestation is continuing at alarming rates. Since 1990, 420 million hectares of forests have been lost through conversion to other land use. And when verified and certified, offsets can be a lifeline to carbon-absorbing ecosystems that are under threat from human encroachment. And it's because of this, one of the clear trends we're seeing now in the carbon markets is an increased demand for nature-based solutions for a company or government mitigating their emissions footprint, and that includes Australia. And one of the reasons is that nature offsets have a significant impact on biodiversity, both life on land and life below water, SDGs 14 and 15. I think of a large area of land in Cambodia that was earmarked for deforestation from a palm oil company. This is a biodiversity hotspot. To illustrate this, just use a real example in southern Cardamom in Cambodia. A world-leading project developer, who you know, Chris, very well, Wildlife Works, we work with, joined forces with the Cambodian Minister of Environment and launched a RED program and protected that land of 500,000 hectares from being deforested, avoiding 3 million tonne of carbon emissions per annum and protecting 55 endangered species, including Asian elephants and the black bear. It also positively impacted 16,000 families who inhabit the protection zone through improved healthcare facilities and scholarships. This is all funded through the sale of carbon offsets to mainly international corporations, some of them which are in Australia. We can generate now a fair value for each of those co-benefits, which brings transparency in price and justifies a premium a high-impact corporate will or should pay for those credits. It also allows a project developer to model his future cash flows, knowing what price the market will pay, allowing a greater investment in technology, infrastructure, and job creation to generate those SDGs. So there's still much more to be done. Value discovery and awareness is the biggest obstacle to urgent and much needed capital flows into climate and sustainability markets. If more buyers and sellers could see what the true attributed value of SDGs were for every carbon offset project, more capital would flow into the voluntary carbon markets, and that would help fund additional projects. So there's a lot to do, but it's an exciting space to be in. We see the carbon markets as the next key commodity, and maybe that's why the adoption rates have been increasing at rapid speeds and why we continue to grow and invest the company. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much, Eddie. That's very exciting. We're going to talk about the voluntary market soon. I'll move on to Megan now. Dr. Megan Evans, welcome. We're keen to hear about your role and also a little bit about the private sector, because you're involved in learning about the big trends and what you've observed recently in this environmental protection sector, both in Australia and perhaps even internationally, like Eddie was mentioning, the importance of the international markets as well.
Thank you so much, Chris. I've just put some, I'm sorry, I can't help it. I've got some slides. I'm an academic, I have to do it. Hope you can see those. So yes, I will touch a little bit on international trends, but my focus and my interest is Australia, so I will be eventually zooming into there. So thanks for having me in this great session. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra, and I wish to honour their elders past and present and acknowledge that the sovereignty of First Nations land was never ceded. So I'm going to give you a bit of a flavour of what's going on in the biodiversity finance space, which is my area of interest, and I'm currently undertaking some research interviews of key actors in this space, because it's really growing very, very rapidly. And as Eddie mentioned, there's the carbon market, obviously, and now we're starting to see the private sector move on not just climate risk, but also nature risk. So this here is the Kunming Declaration, which at the COP15 in October last year, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which includes Australia, committed to develop, adopt and implement an effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And there's CBD negotiations further negotiations in April and May this year. An important reference in the Kunming Declaration is to align all financial flows in support of the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And this report from the OECD, which came out in 2020, defined what is meant by biodiversity finance. So it refers to financial flows from both public and private sources, as well as mobilised through various financial instruments. And it estimated that currently global biodiversity finance is at around $78 to $91 billion per year at a global level. And that's primarily coming from domestic public sources. It also found that the world currently spends about 5 to 6 times that amount on incentives and subsidies that directly or indirectly harm biodiversity. And this report here comes from the Paulson Institute, also from 2020. And this report estimated what they refer to as the biodiversity finance gap. So this difference between what the world currently spends and what it needs to spend to protect biodiversity. And it estimated that gap at around $820 billion US dollars per year. So they found that financing gap can be reduced by reducing some of these biodiversity harmful subsidies shown here in the red. That always seems to happen for some reason. It's too far ahead. But there's also lots of opportunity to produce new revenue in emerging markets, fiscal reform, as well as leveraging off carbon markets. Okay, finally. So there's a lot of interest in biodiversity finance at the moment, and my team and I have identified over 150 reports published in the last 20 years, talking broadly about biodiversity finance. And about half of that have emerged just in the last couple of years. So that gives you a good indicator of the interest. And these are reports coming from industry and government. These aren't academic peer-reviewed reports, which indicates that the sector is moving at such a pace that slow academics like me can't really keep up. But I'm just going to highlight a couple here. So this one is from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, which came out in November last year and was led by EY. And they identified that the Australian economy could lose up to 27 billion annually as a result of nature loss. And Australian investors are exposed to both domestic and global biodiversity risks through the value chains in their portfolios. This one here is from the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. And it released its first beta framework just last week. And that document includes some draft disclosure recommendations, as well as a structured process for identifying nature-related risks and opportunities. And the TNFD framework is intended to be used by investors, financial institutions, corporates, governments, stock exchanges, as well as ESG data providers to understand and act on nature-related risks and opportunities. So coming back to New South Wales now, the Minister touched on a few of these findings, but I just want to, because I guess this webinar was focused on biodiversity, I just wanted to pull out a couple of things that were of interest to me in particular. It did note that the number of threatened species and ecological communities are increasing by about 2% every year, and we know that that trend is unfortunately getting worse. I do want to acknowledge, however, that the New South Wales Government has made really quite significant investments in threatened species protection, including through the Saving Our Species program and the Biodiversity Conservation Trust on private land. Unfortunately, though, we do know that based on the data shown in the State of the Environment report, that investment is still not quite enough to address that decline. And that's largely because based on current estimates, it's likely that the amount of investment needed to prevent the extinction of just the most threatened species and ecological communities in Australia right now will require billions, not millions. So an order of magnitude more than what we're investing now. And this is a peer-reviewed article that came out a couple of years ago that did an assessment for all of Australia, and they compare to the US endangered species funding. So just a couple of final things. Looking through the State of the Environment report, the clearest finding for me was not in the biodiversity chapter per se, but in the land chapter. And the Minister pointed to this in his address just before. And it points to some pretty dramatic findings in the rate of loss of the extent and quality of native vegetation. We know that habitat loss is the most crucial threat to biodiversity in Australia and globally, and most of this occurs on private lands. This graph here is even more stark. We can unfortunately see that when the Biodiversity Conservation Act came into effect in 2017, there has effectively been a doubling of native vegetation clearing, largely in agricultural landscapes in New South Wales. So on that happy note, I will stop there, but I'm happy to offer some of my predictions or suggestions on how some of these problems can be dealt with in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Megan. Definitely there are questions for you, I'm sure. And we're moving on to Nat from the ACF. Can you maybe give us your insights on nature risks? And I was hoping you can also discuss how we can better educate Australians about the state of the nature, because even though we seem to be a nation of nature lovers, we're largely still quite oblivious, I think, to the rate of destruction that there is there. And Megan has, posed to us, the extent of species that are disappearing and how much it costs to actually preserve them.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody. Look, and I'll try to be quick. I'm coming to you from Wongal land in Sydney. I work at ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation. It's a big old conservation NGO in Australia that's been around for a bit over 50 years, with a pretty big network of 700,000 or so Australian supporters. In the past, it's done everything from initiating land care, the organisation that's been really successful, to campaigning on fossil fuel projects. And look, as Chris pointed out, one of the bits of work we're trying to do is to elevate the nature conversation in Australia amongst Australian audiences, amongst the public. Our research, finds what I guess lots of us all know, is that Australians do love and have a very close affinity with nature, and for First Nations people who've been here for tens of thousands of years, the connection's even stronger than that. But largely there's a lack of awareness among the public around the state of nature, which is why it's important that we keep producing reports like the State of the Environment, state by state and federally. But obviously the word isn't getting out there. So I think a lot of Australians recognise that nature's in decline globally, but maybe they have an image of Sumatran tigers or white rhinoceroses in their mind when they think of that. We know the Amazon's being cleared. We don't recognise that Australia is one of the world's hotspots for deforestation and land clearing. Those are just facts of the environment in Australia that the public is largely unaware of. And we know the conversation has taken a long time to move people to awareness and wanting action on climate. We hope that we can learn a lot from that experience and generate a lot of interest and support for greater action on nature without going down the path of kind of political polarization and so on that we went through with climate. So that's what ACF's trying to do. We kind of work on a couple of different streams across our work. We obviously have an entire climate campaign focused pretty heavily on fossil fuel exports. We have an economy and democracy team that's trying to strengthen the role of the economy, the financial sector, the way our democracy works, so that it supports better outcomes for nature and for climate. And then we have a nature program team, which has largely been focused on our federal environmental laws, which we all know are not working. in fact, they're failing pretty badly, and the kind of record of loss of species and loss of habitat since those laws came into place is pretty stark evidence that we need new laws, and above all, with some really important standards above them. And then the bit of work that I'm working on in particular is on business and nature, and that's a fairly new area for ACF. A lot of it we're working around both the nature-related risk and opportunity we think exists. That is, it's nascent. It is a new topic for a lot of businesses in Australia, or everywhere, in fact. But we're a little bit behind Europe on this stuff. So we want to make sure that not only Australian businesses, but the people who rely on those businesses, people invested in those businesses, people who have their super in funds that are perhaps not managing their own nature-related risk well, start to understand how important the health of the environment is to the economy and to our way of life in Australia. So that's one of our first tasks in trying to elevate the story about why nature is so important, is to remind people of how fundamentally we depend on nature. Lots of people will have heard that more than half of global GDP, or $44 trillion, is dependent on nature. It was a report produced by the World Economic Forum in 2020. And that story and that number has filtered through, I think, to a lot of people in the business community, but it hasn't filtered through to the Australian public. So one of our early tasks is to try to educate Australians and to produce some of the research that would explain to all of us why it's important to protect nature, the responsibility that businesses have, but also the responsibility that governments have, not only to set standards and legislate, but to make sure the data are available to all of us to make good decisions around nature. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and of course we're trying to integrate our climate work better with our nature work at ACF. And I think just to touch on the theme of the talk today, the state of the environment in New South Wales, it mirrors what I suspect we're going to see in a couple of weeks when we see the National State of the Environment report. We're losing habitat really quickly still, despite lots of commitments made globally by business and governments to stop losing habitat. So we need to do something about that, and for that we need really clear targets and outcome-focused targets and objectives. And I think that's where the Nature COP, the Global Biodiversity Framework, comes in. It's a piece of work that we think is really important. These are a set of goals that will be with us for 10 years. They replace a set of goals that were devised 10 or 12 years ago now, actually, because of delays. And so we think there's kind of five important steps that Australia needs to or five important goals Australia needs to support at these global goals. And one of them is an overarching mission or commitment that we will reverse the rate of biodiversity loss that we're seeing at the moment, so that by 2030 nature is in better health than it is now. So that means more biodiversity, more nature, more national parks, sure, but more vegetation, more and healthier vegetation on private land as well. We need a commitment to end the extinction of species, which unfortunately we're a leader in. We need commitments with numbers in them to protect and restore habitat in Australia. So current target is a minimum of 30% of land and sea, but it has to be actually much higher than that, or to be protected. We do need to strengthen the link between climate and nature, both in our decision-making and in our funding for nature programs. And then we need to embed nature into decision-making faster than we've done it for climate. And so that means, Megan touched on the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I think that's a really important step. That needs to move much faster than we did when it came to businesses measuring their exposure to climate-related risk and setting targets. So businesses supported by governments are going to have to understand how much they both rely on and are impacting on nature, and then really quickly set science-based targets to reduce that impact, especially. And that's going to take a bit of work with governments, partly to put in place perhaps mandatory disclosure, but also help facilitate the data and information needed for businesses to make those decisions. So there's lots of work for us to do. I'm particularly focused on the business and the nature risk side of things, but I'm also really excited about the potential from COP15, and really happy to work with subnational governments. New South Wales has been a leader, and as well as businesses on raising ambition around those global goals.
Thank you very much, Nat. You mentioned a lot the role of business, and so we've got the role of government, role of business, and when it comes to the environment, or including biodiversity, I do feel like we need a better understanding of those roles, or the relationship between the economy and environment, and how these two systems interact is really important. I think Eddie has a really good grasp on it, but I was going to maybe ask the minister first on the role of government while he's here with us, because I would like to understand in your view, and I know, Megan, you quoted, I've got a quote from you that was very interesting. You mentioned that governments routinely underestimate the time and resources required for markets to become established, and the crucial role that governments in providing leadership, de-risking investment, and setting the rules that provide business with certainty and confidence to participate. So I'm going to put it to James, who is obviously a conservationist and also business-minded, being in government. What is it that you see being the role of government in this journey and interaction with business to improve what we're doing in the biodiversity sector?
I think that there's a number of elements to it, and I think it leads in neatly to what Eddie and Megan had to say in terms of, I think, the gap between what government can contribute in funding various programs like we have with Saving Our Species, or the 70 million per annum to fund the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. But even then, there is a gap in what is required. Second to that, I think, we've all been probably reading with great interest some of the global discussions that are taking place around the carbon market and some of the challenges in different jurisdictions that it's facing because of issues around transparency or a needed maturity for various frameworks. So certainly from our perspective, and one example that has come live only just this week has been our announcement around the Primary Industries Productivity and Abatement Program, which has an incredibly long name, but essentially it seeks to do three things. So 52 million or thereabouts dedicated to develop market and industry foundations. That includes providing data and metrics and frameworks to assess carbon and biodiversity outcomes. 72 million to build critical mass and capacity, so incentives for land managers to reduce emissions, but it's got to be at scale. And then $1 million to accelerate finance for natural capital and low carbon farming. So government working directly with finance sector to increase investments in natural capital. So we sort of see our role as the development of framework, the stabilizing of markets where it's needed, and supporting the market to then get on and play the role that, as Megan put up, there's been so much literature produced, and I think the market in Australia are certainly ready to go. We've just got to work collectively to get that activated. So that sort of in three broad steps, I think, sets out what I think our role is in that space.
Thanks. I wonder if maybe Eddie wants to add anything to the, where business fits in, and what is business looking forward from government in terms of signaling?
Well, from a global perspective, the big issue really is that emissions have actually increased by almost 2.1 gigatons from 2020. That puts 2021 above 2010 as the largest ever year-on-year increase in energy-related CO2 emissions. And even if you take Ukraine and Russia out of the equation right now, we are in a global energy shortage. So if you look at the breakdown of the 2022 energy consumption, coal is 30% and declining, oil contributes 30% and plateauing, gas at 25% and slowing, and that leaves 15% for solar and wind, which is 5 times larger than it was 2 years ago and likely to quintuple again by 2030. But the fact is that it takes at least 2 years of more energy consumption to get a renewable business off the ground and to hit those quintuple type targets. So there's really little left in our view other than at least proactively stopping deforestation. And one of the clear signals from Glasgow was the unanimous decision by both private and public sector to stop deforestation. And as a large contributor to emissions, and I'm reading some of the questions coming now around logging and job losses, etc., it doesn't necessarily have to be the case if you work together, private sector and the governments, to create a vibrant, RED type program. We met last week with the environment minister, the environment minister of PNG, and he said something quite powerful and with passion and real intent. He pledged post his Glasgow trip to stop all logging by 2030. And he said that logging is a large contributor to their GDP. And as the least developed country, that needs to industrialize or play catch up to the West. Those logging revenues need to be replaced. So a RED and a vibrant carbon market monitored under a national framework could easily more than replace those logging revenues and create local employment, infrastructure along the way. And he said that any country and corporate doing business in PNG should be compelled to offset their emissions with PNG nature-based carbon credits. And it's really a win-win scenario where both the private sector funds the PNG job creation and enhances their GDP, and at the same time addresses emissions and deforestation. So there are many cases like this. Microsoft is doing the same thing. Workday, Sonodex, they're all looking for nature-based solutions globally. It doesn't have to be in their own turf to reduce their global emissions footprint. And it really is a partnership with government. As the minister said earlier, you need the right framework, the right core principles and best market practices to create this international carbon market.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the voluntary carbon market, correct me if I'm wrong, Geddy, it's still relatively small in scale. Do you see that changing? And how can institutional investors and capital markets generally be encouraged to redeploy into the ESG space?
I think it's a smallish market now. Carbon markets globally are around 700 billion if you include the compliant carbon markets. So EU ETS is the largest one. Then you've got the Australian Carbon Credit Unit under the Clean Energy Regulator, New Zealand, some subnational schemes globally. Then Article 6 came out in Glasgow, which indicated an international trading of carbon credits, which all of a sudden brings the voluntary carbon markets into the international markets where they can be fungible. And I think that's when scale really happens. And McKinsey and others have all said, we think that the numbers are actually quite conservative, that it could easily be a $180 billion market by 2030, up from 3 or 4 billion last year. So yes, a small market today, but the adoption rates, as I said earlier, are really ramping up at warp speed.
That's right. Would you like to say something, Megan?
I do. So a couple of things. I guess if I can perhaps offer a slightly different view, or I was told recently that I'm very good at being negative, so I'm going to take that as a positive. So just be warned. I guess I would say yes, but to offsets. As someone who has researched both biodiversity and carbon offsets the last decade or so and has helped design offsets policies at the federal level, yes, they are part of the solution, but they can't be the only avenue. We're not going to be able to offset our way out of climate change and biodiversity loss. So they do play a role, but it's that, they are meant to be the last stage in the mitigation hierarchy, which is avoid, minimise, offset. Unfortunately, they are still routinely used as the first resort. So that's just that kind of background point, I suppose. I did want to, I guess, make an observation just based on what we've heard today, and also some of my research that I'm doing at the moment, where I'm interviewing folks broadly involved in this biodiversity finance space, which is it's really getting, I guess, it's quite nebulous, and the number and diversity of actors is increasing. We've gone from, I guess, in the last 20 years, it's been governments who've been putting forward, private land conservation schemes and being the leaders. Now we're starting to see private sector players come out and actually develop and put forward their own kind of voluntary credit products. So landholders, I think, are going to be starting to see not just, okay, I could sign up to the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, but I could also go with this option, option B, option C, which is going to make things potentially a little bit more complex. So the final thing I wanted to say is in terms of the role of the market and where the role of government sits within that, there's, I guess, two sides that I kind of see of where the market can play in. One is what we've been talking about so far in terms of getting more people involved, or more landholders, involved in private land conservation, really recruiting more landholders, boosting that supply side of the equation in terms of offsets or credits or what have you. The other side that I think is really interesting, and I was really excited to hear the ministers, I haven't read the full details of that announcement today, but in terms of supporting the financial sector to do or to improve their literacy with natural capital accounting and that kind of thing. So we've got the opportunity side of the equation, where we kind of say to landholders, there's an opportunity to access new revenue streams with the Biodiversity Conservation Trust or carbon offsets, whatever. There's also this risk side of the equation, whereby large corporates, as well as the financial sector itself, is starting to go, we're exposed to nature risk, and the TNFD has that framework. But what are they going to be doing to try to mitigate their risks? And at the moment, it might be, banks or other financial institutions saying to their mortgagees, so landholders, saying, it'd be really good if you could maybe do a natural capital account or environmental account for your property, see how much natural capital you've got. We might give you a discount on your loan if you do this and demonstrate that you're retaining natural vegetation. And I think some banks are starting to do that, like Rabobank and NAB, for example. I think in time, that is actually going to start to mature a little bit. And instead of doing here's an incentive to do this, it's going to be, you need to do this. And if you don't, banks might not be providing finance to, I guess, landholders or others who aren't effectively mitigating their nature risks. I think, early days, but my feeling is that might be a bit of a game changer, but we need to kind of, provide the capacity and the support and the literacy to enable the market to transition to that.
Thank you, Megan. I have so many questions here for the Minister, James, just moving away a little bit from, market-based solutions. There are some questions, of course, about koalas, and I have to combine them all in one. Basically, I'll combine them in saying, how is the government tackling koala extinction, and how is the government protecting their habitat?
Yep, thanks, Chris. I think it's worth acknowledging, as sad as it is, but I guess a welcome, issue is the uplisting of the koala by the federal government recently to endangered. And I think it acknowledges the challenges that they're experiencing around the country. With that, they brought a $50 million contribution to conservation and supporting koala habitat, critical koala habitat. In New South Wales, we are committed to doubling the koala population, and to back that up, we have committed and will be rolling out shortly $193 million worth of initiatives to support the koalas in the state, whether that be through supporting and growing critical koala habitat, further science and data to support population numbers, and a whole host of other initiatives. That $193 million is a clear contribution of how important we see this issue and the commitment to double their population. A key central component of that will be the acquisition and growth of critical koala habitat. And I know that is an issue that is dear and challenging to a lot of people. So that is one of the fundamental pillars of our support for koala conservation. It will be continuing to support critical koala habitat, whether that be in the South Coast, North Coast, or across the state.
Thanks, James. Maybe the next question leads into that, which is talking about wildlife corridors. How does government intend to achieve better distribution of development and retention of adequate green space and wildlife corridors? To date, it seems like that's been a bit ignored in the planning of urban and regional areas.
Yeah, I think it is a challenge. I mean, the preservation of green corridors and it is critically important. I mean, and this goes back to my earlier point around the fact that we've got about 10% of the state in the reserve system, but at the same time you've got 60% which is held by private landowners. So, going back to the discussion that we've just been having, how do you encourage private landowners to participate in conservation and linking up corridors wherever it may be? I think in urban in the Greater Sydney area, we've got to continue working with councils and other stakeholders to ensure that that's built into planning and design principles. But ultimately, we'll continue, whether it's a part of the koala strategy or through various acquisitions in the reserve, or working with private landowners to continue to expand corridors and critical koala habitat, and ultimately linking up the state where we can to provide great conservation principles and outcomes.
Thanks, James. And while you're there, just a last question for you on, well, there's quite a few here, but let's talk about packaging and plastic.
Yep.
It's a major environmental issue, plastic, as we know. What are the plans for your plans or New South Wales for reducing plastic waste? I know that there's been a few things already implemented. Why isn't the closed loop glass packaging reintroduced by standardizing sizes and EPR deposit refunds on all containers?
Yeah, so I think one of the great success stories over the past couple of years has been the return and earn scheme, or the container deposit scheme, as many people would have historically known it. That's received 7 billion bottles or containers. It marked that milestone recently. About 700,000 tonnes worth of plastic and bottles out of our litter streams. This month we opened Australia's largest plastic recycling facility down in Albury. And that was catalysed through government investment. So I think when it comes to circular economy and plastics in particular, you're starting to see, in many respects, the outcomes of several years worth of discussions and a shift, certainly by industry, in recognising that consumers wanted a different outcome, and indeed the environment needed it one way or another. So a lot of people are still catching up to the news that in June, the ban on plastic bags will come into effect, single-use plastics in New South Wales. And then in November, that will be followed up by single-use cutlery and straws and stirrers and other items. So that's still coming into effect. And then on top of that, we're working closely with the recycling and waste industry to keep turbocharging the circular economy and looking at all ways that we can either deal with plastic at the source, or ultimately turn that into a reusable item, whether it's through the recycling facility down in Albury, which is one of many that are popping up across the state. So I think circular economy and dealing with plastic pollution is something that we're making great strides in, but again, we can always continue to do better, and we will.
I'm sure you will. Thanks, James. One question that seems to come quite often, in everything we do lately, is whether we think it's achievable at the current rate that we're going, the current rate of progress, that we actually will get to net zero by 2050. So, in the light of the report and with what we're doing here about talking about carbon offsets, I may ask each of you for your opinion on that. I know that the governments around the world are continuing to work towards that unified goal of the net zero by 2050, some doing more than others. But let's start with Eddie. Do you think it's achievable at our current rate of progress that we will reach that goal by 2050, Eddie? And what will be really the determinant points for us to achieve that goal?
Well, unproven technology needs to work to start with. I mean, net zero effectively means carbon removals and stop all the all the avoided emissions combined. And as I said earlier, we are in a bit of an energy shortage right now. We're still heavily reliant on gas, oil, and coal. It's an expensive exercise on renewables. That's going to work in the short term. There'll probably be an increase in emissions, but over the decades, there needs to be continued investment in direct air carbon capture, improve regenerative farming practices. As we said earlier, land and agriculture makes up 20% of global emissions. So farmers need to improve. They need to turn off some of the agricultural revenue and include some of the best market practices for farming to sequester more carbon. We need to protect ecosystems. I saw one of the comments on the Q&A around seaweed. They're big carbon sinks globally. This all requires investment on the private capital, the private markets. If we do all of that and start investing in, a decade-long carbon removal projects, I think we've got a shot at it.
Thank you. Let's go to Nat.
Look, yeah, I mean, clearly it is achievable. Maybe I can touch on one of the points raised by the joint IPBES and IPCC, that the international biodiversity and climate scientific bodies that pointed out that we can't solve the climate crisis without also solving the biodiversity crisis, and vice versa. We can't solve either of those without addressing both. So I think the importance of nature-based solutions to climate change is going to become more and more apparent. That does need private and public money. Without wanting to bring up offsets, again, they do have a place, but if offsets are not being used as a last resort, which is the current process, then we still have fossil fuel companies opening up new oil and gas fields while they're claiming to offset them or plan to offset them in the future. And so if we continue doing that, then no, we can't meet net zero, and neither will we meet our biodiversity targets. So yeah, look, it can be done, but it both needs better target setting by governments, and then those targets need to be implemented through regulations and incentives. The offset market needs to be tidied up to avoid some of those spurious practices.
Thank you. Megan.
Yeah, I won't say much more than what's been said, but I guess just to say that, emissions from fossil fuels and emissions sequestered by land-based carbon, nature-based solutions, we treat them as substitutable, but they're not really. I mean, when we dig up fossil fuels, there's a huge immediate release of emissions, and nature-based solutions, carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, they take years to accumulate and to sequester that carbon. So just to kind of bear in mind that, yeah, as Nat said, at the moment, we are still approving these kinds of projects on the promise that we'll offset them, and those offsets they may not necessarily come online until years later, if at all, because we know that there are governance issues around offsets actually occurring when they've been approved.
Thanks, Megan. And James, what are your views on the net zero by 2050? We're all very excited about New South Wales, trying to halve their emissions by 2030. So there's a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, well, I think let's go back to the sort of genesis of our discussion, which was State of the Environment report. It's transparent, and it demonstrated a 17% drop in emissions in New South Wales. So I think we've been pretty clear on our aims. We've been incredibly transparent and set targets and data driven. So I think we're well on our way to reach net zero by 2050. That's detailed in our net zero plan, stage 1. And broadly speaking, I think we're facing the challenge of global warming with our climate change policy framework in New South Wales. So I think it demonstrates what can happen, and the great improvements that can be made when government puts its mind to something and just gets on with it. But I do. I think Nat's right. I mean, it's all well and good to do that, but the other side of the equation is biodiversity challenge, and we've got to turn our mind to considering that as well.
Thank you very much, James. That's all the time we have, unfortunately, for our Q&A. Time has gone really quickly. So I'd like to take the opportunity, of course, to once again express our appreciation on behalf of C4C to all of you, to all our panelists, for sharing your knowledge, and also would like to thank, of course, the audience for your contribution to the discussions. There's a lot of things on the Q&A and also on the chat. It's really encouraging, as I mentioned to the Minister, to see the New South Wales government's leadership and taking this decisive, responsible action on climate change and setting your objectives to halve emissions by 2030. We'll definitely continue as C4C to support the work you're doing, James, and support the work that everyone's doing on that space. Eddie, Megan, and Nat, congratulations on what you do. And I thank everyone for joining us and for participating at our events. If you are not part of C4C, or if you wish to receive our invitations, just go online and register on coalitionconservation.com.au. We'll be doing a lot more of those, hopefully more face-to-face events as well. So we'll be seeing you shortly. Thank you very much, and everyone have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris and all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and everyone.
Thank you.